So I'm actually going to mix a couple of topics. I'm going to talk about how to use data, and that's really the primary thing I want to talk about, but I'm also going to talk briefly about analytics and how analytics is working. Both data, but different ends, right, of the application. Before I do that, though, I want to just riff a little bit on what Paul was talking about. Somebody in this room could be the person who writes the app that causes 1 million people to install a selector. That's very possible. And what's cool about that is that the network effects of what is happening means that everybody in this room would benefit from that app. Because if you haven't tried it, install a selector and then put a card in it. Putting a card in a selector is not an installation. It doesn't even deserve to be called an installation. It's so trivial. Once somebody has a selector, it's easy. So all of us benefit from the network effects of what developers do to get people to download and install a selector. Like we talked about earlier, that's all based on give them a good experience, they'll do it. You know, nobody wants a quarter-inch drill, they all want quarter-inch holes. All right, so let's talk about data. When you build a web application, there are at least 3 big problems you got to solve with data. Particularly when you build a web application that wants data in the client. The first one is that browsers are trying to prevent cross-site scripting attacks, and they can't tell the difference between a cross-site scripting attack and you loading some data from a third-party website. So you can't just use an XML HTTP request, for example, to grab data from a third-party website. The browser will shut you down.
Because it's cookie-based.
So, yeah, because it doesn't know who you are, it doesn't know whether it's permissioned, right? There's just not enough information. So what people have come up with all kinds of interesting workarounds for this. JSON-P is probably the one that works best. What I'm going to show you is that when you use KRL, you don't have to worry about that because we're just going to solve that problem. Okay? The second thing that you have to worry about with data, and especially when you're trying to make things fast, is caching it. Are you going to build a system? How's it going to be cached? Where is it going to be cached? What's the browser going to do with it? These are all questions that, as a developer, you have to solve. And there are lots of little web techniques for managing this and making it happen. I'm going to show you how KRL makes it so that you don't really have to worry about that. You can just specify what you want to have happen, and we'll take care of the details. The third thing you got to worry about is format. You know, is it JSON? Is it XML? Once it's there, what do I do with it? If it's XML, how am I going to parse it? All of those kinds of questions. I'm going to show you how we handle that problem too. So here are the Kynetx things that we have done in KRL to manage these problems. And I should mention, by the way, since I'm here and talking about KRL, Kynetx rule language, one of the questions that I get every once in a while, I used to get a lot more frequently than I get now, is why did you design a language, right? Because we all kind of have this bias against learning new languages, and that the languages that are out there, general purpose languages, you can do just about anything in any general purpose language. Why would anybody design a new language? Right? You might even be thinking that yourself. There's a very simple reason why I designed a new language. One, I believe that linguistic abstraction has huge power. That as developers, we gain productivity by having the correct linguistic abstraction. And there was no language available which I believed met the needs of what we were trying to do, as well as something that we could design and build ourselves. And so mostly what I'm going to be showing you here is things in KRL. You're just going to write things in a language. Underneath the covers, there's a lot of web stuff happening, which if you programmed on the web, you'll understand a lot of the details of what has to happen. But I hope you'll realize that what you're getting is huge leverage and not having to worry about those things yourself. The other thing I want to say about a language before I go on is every time I've designed a web interface, people have used that web interface exactly the way I thought they'd use that web interface. Right? Nobody has ever used a web interface in ways that surprised me. Every time I've designed a language, people surprise and amaze me every day with what they do with it. That's the power of language over interface. Language has great power. So let's talk about the first thing in Kynetx or in KRL that allows us to deal with data, and that's a data set. This is kind of the simplest kind of data. A data set is exactly what you think it is. It is a fixed, static set of data. So somewhere out online, there's a JSON file or an XML file or whatever. We want to read it and use it. We're not going to query it. We're not going to do anything. We're just going to grab the data. This is actually handier than you think. There's quite a few interesting rule sets that have been built with it. For example, the AAA demo, which I showed you earlier, which Azigo has built, uses data sets, right? The data set essentially says, where do I get discounts, right? Where does AAA offer discounts? That's the data set. So when you're using a data set in KRL, you specify it this way. And you do this in the global section of the rule set. You just say, I want to have a data set, I want to call it foo, and here's where you get it from. You give it the URL. Sam mentioned a little bit that when you're writing a KRL rule set, you're actually building something that's going to run in a dual execution environment. Part of the rule set runs on our server, and part of the rule set runs in the browser. Okay? We try to insulate you from that as much as possible. It's not always possible. It's not always possible. We try to insulate you from that as much as possible. So a good example of that is a rule set. If you declare a rule set called foo and get the data from it, that data set, yeah. That data set, the data in that data set, is available both on the server with that name and in the client with that name. So the data is available in both places, and you can use the variable in both places without having to worry about, you know, oh, is it declared on the server, but it's not on the client. It's in both places, you just use it. Now, often what you want to do is you want to cache the data. And it turns out that the default is to cache data for 20 minutes. So if you just did that, what would happen is we would cache the data that we retrieved from that URL for 20 minutes on our server. If you say cacheable, if you put the keyword cacheable on that, the default, when you say cacheable, is 24 hours. There's a good reason why we picked 24 hours. We actually cache our initialization script for 24 hours on the browser. So if you cache your data for that long or longer, we'll push it down to the browser with a cache header so that the browser holds onto it too and doesn't reload it. So that's important from a, oh, I didn't click it through, sorry about that, like that. Now cacheable, you can also add a time to it. So you can say cacheable for 20 minutes, for example, or you can say cacheable for 3 hours. And it will interpret that and cache it. Now, like I said, there's a little bit of difference between what happens on the server and the client from a caching perspective, because clients are not as flexible as we'd like them to be. The server is, this is how long it will be cached on the server. So that's a data set. It's a static piece of data. It's available in that variable, and I'll show you how you can actually use the data in a second. It's available in that variable, it's available on the server, it's available on the client. If you want to cache, just say cache this, it gets taken care of. You don't have to worry about how do I get it down to the browser, is it JSON-P, where do I cache it, do I have to stand up a memcached server in order to run the caching? You don't have to do any of that, we supply all of that infrastructure. Okay, the second way to access data is a little bit more flexible, and that's called a data source. The difference between a data set and a data source is a data source is something that's queryable. So it's something that's dynamic and is changing, and you're going to want to query depending on how the rule set works. So let me show you an example. You declare a data source in the global block just like you do a data set, and this is the syntax you can see is very similar. The only thing is the keyword is data source instead of data set. And the same cacheable modifiers are applicable to the data source statement as available to the data set